Maybe this necklace will finally make you look like you belong in this room." Those were the words Daniel Whitmore said to his own wife in front of 200 guests on her birthday. He handed her a box like he was doing charity. He smiled like a man who had already won. And behind him, another woman waited to take her place. What Daniel didn't know was that the quiet woman he was humiliating owned the very company his father worshipped. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And comment the city you're watching from right now so I can see how far this story has traveled. The Grand Leora Hotel had hosted senators, film stars, and men whose fortunes could buy small countries. But on that Friday evening in early autumn, it hosted the Whitmore family, and everyone who mattered in the wealthy circles of Upper New York understood that a Whitmore event was not a party. It was a performance, and Richard Whitmore intended to be the star. He stood near the entrance of the ballroom in a tailored charcoal suit, greeting his guests with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 30 years pretending he liked people he needed. His silver hair was combed back, his handshake was firm, and every time a wealthy guest complimented the evening, Richard's chest swelled a little more. "Richard, you've outdone yourself," said an old business partner named Howard Price, clasping his hand. "For family, Howard, only the best," Richard answered. Though the truth was that he had put the entire evening on a line of credit he was praying no one would ask about. Across the room, his son Daniel Whitmore moved through the crowd like he already owned it. At 36, Daniel had inherited his father's jaw, his father's confidence, and unfortunately, his father's belief that the world was divided into two kinds of people, the ones who mattered and the ones who served. Daniel had spent his whole life certain he belonged to the first group. He had never once questioned it. "There he is," a man called out, raising a glass. "The lucky husband. Where's the birthday girl?" Daniel's smile flickered for just a moment, so fast that only someone watching closely would have caught it. "She'll be down soon," Daniel said. "You know how she is. Quiet. Doesn't like the attention." The man laughed. "Smart woman. Half the people in this room would kill for the attention." Daniel laughed too, but it was a hollow sound, because the woman he was talking about, the woman whose birthday this supposedly was, had become an embarrassment to him. Or so he had convinced himself. Clara Voss did not sparkle. She did not command a room. She wore simple dresses and simple shoes, and she smiled at waiters and remembered their names, which Daniel found almost unbearable. 3 years ago, when he married her, he had told himself she was refreshing, humble, real. Now, standing in a ballroom full of glittering people, that same quality felt like a stain on his reputation. And there was another reason his smile kept slipping. Her name was Vanessa Cross. She stood near the far wall in a wine-colored dress that clung to her like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against subtlety. 31 years old, an investment consultant with ambition sharp enough to cut glass, Vanessa had been meeting Daniel in hotel rooms and private lounges for the better part of 8 months. And tonight she caught his eye across the ballroom and gave him a slow, knowing smile that made his pulse jump. Tonight was the night. They had planned it together in whispers, in the dark. Daniel would end his marriage in front of everyone. He would do it publicly, cleanly, and he would do it in a way that made him look like the reasonable one, the patient husband who had simply grown apart from a woman who never fit his world. He didn't know he was about to make the single greatest mistake of his life. Upstairs, in a modest suite that Daniel had booked, Clara Voss sat at a small vanity and looked at her own reflection. She was 34 years old, though her calm made her seem older, wiser, unbothered by the noise of the world below. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. Her dress was elegant but quiet, a deep navy that most of the women downstairs would have considered too plain for such an event. She knew what tonight was. She had known for weeks. A woman in Clara's position did not build a company from nothing without learning how to read people, and Daniel had become very easy to read. The late nights, the perfume that wasn't hers on his jacket, the way he flinched when she touched his hand, the phone he now carried face down and locked. Clara had seen it all, and she had said nothing, not because she was weak, because she was waiting. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, a woman named Priya, who had been with her since the beginning. The message read simply, "Everything is in place. Marcus is on standby. Say the word." Clara looked at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back 3 letters. Not yet. She set the phone down and stood. She smoothed her dress. And she thought, as she often did, about her mother. Her mother had built the first sketches of what would one day become Aureline Mason on the back of a diner napkin in a 2-room apartment with a baby daughter sleeping in a crib beside her. Her mother had died before she could see what those sketches became. But she had left Clara with one sentence, spoken so many times it had carved itself into Clara's bones. Real value does not need to shout. Let your work speak before your name does. Clara had lived by those words. She had built Aureline Mason into a luxury empire admired by billionaires and royalty, and she had done it while keeping her name almost entirely out of the press. She used holding companies. She let others be the public face. She sat in board meetings that decided the fate of nations, and then went home to a husband who thought she was a mid-level designer at a firm he had never bothered to ask about. She had hidden all of it, deliberately, because 3 years ago, when a handsome man named Daniel Whitmore had approached her at a gallery opening, she had wanted, just once, to know if a man could love her without knowing what she was worth. Now she had her answer. She picked up a small black box from the vanity, slipped it into her clutch, and walked to the door. "Happy birthday to me," she said softly, to no one. Then she went downstairs. The moment Clara entered the ballroom, the temperature of the room seemed to shift, though most of the guests couldn't have said why. She did not make an entrance. She simply appeared at the edge of the crowd and began to move through it with a quiet grace that drew more eyes than any grand gesture could have. Richard Whitmore spotted her and his mouth tightened. "Clara," he said, meeting her halfway with a stiff smile. You look like yourself." "Thank you, Richard," Clara said pleasantly, as if he had given her a genuine compliment. Richard glanced at her simple dress, and his disappointment was almost physical. He had spent the evening surrounded by women dripping in diamonds, and here was his daughter-in-law, looking like she had wandered in from a library. "You know," Richard said, lowering his voice, "for an event like this, you might have made more of an effort. There are important people here tonight, people whose opinions matter." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And whose opinion matters most to you, Richard?" The question was so gentle that Richard didn't register it as the trap it was. He puffed up. "Everyone in this room could change our family's fortune with a single phone call," he said. "You'd do well to remember that." "I'll try to remember," Clara said. She moved past him before he could say more, and Richard watched her go with the vague irritation of a man who felt he had won an argument but couldn't quite say what he'd won. Near the center of the room, Daniel saw her coming. His heart began to pound, not with love, but with the nervous energy of a man about to do something he had rehearsed 100 times in his head. "Clara," he said, taking her hands in a way that looked affectionate and felt like a performance. "There you are. Everyone's been asking about you." "Have they?" Clara said. "Of course. It's your night." She looked at him, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Daniel felt it, a flicker of unease, as if his wife could see straight through his chest to the plan hidden behind his ribs. He pushed the feeling away. "I have a surprise for you," he said, forcing brightness into his voice. "Something special, in front of everyone." "That's very generous," Clara said quietly. Vanessa, watching from across the room, lifted her champagne glass in a small private toast that only Daniel could see. Richard, sensing that something was about to happen, began gently steering guests toward the center of the room. A few people started to gather. The band lowered their music, and Daniel, feeling the eyes of 200 wealthy strangers turning toward him, straightened his spine and prepared to become, in his own mind, the hero of the evening. He had no idea that within 20 minutes, everything he owned, everything his father owned, and everything he thought he was would begin to fall apart. "Friends," Daniel called out, raising his voice so it carried across the ballroom. "Friends, if I could have your attention for a moment." The chatter died down. Faces turned, waiters paused with trays in their hands. Richard beamed with anticipation, certain his son was about to do something that would make the Whitmore name shine even brighter. "Tonight is my wife Clara's birthday," Daniel began, "and I wanted to mark the occasion with something worthy of this room, something worthy of the Whitmore name." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a black velvet box. He held it up so everyone could see it, turning it slowly like a jeweler at an auction. "This," he announced, "is a genuine Oraline Mason piece, the finest luxury house in the world, a company my father has admired for as long as I can remember." At the word Oraline, Richard actually put a hand to his heart. To him, that name was sacred. It was the summit of everything he aspired to. He had spent years trying to get a meeting with the leadership of Oraline Mason and had never once succeeded. To own a genuine piece was, in his mind, proof that the Whitmores had finally arrived. "Go on, son," Richard said, his voice thick with pride. "Show her." Daniel turned to Clara. And here, his voice changed. The warmth drained out of it, replaced by something colder, something the crowd mistook for playful teasing, but which Clara recognized instantly as contempt. "Clara," Daniel said, opening the box to reveal a necklace of gold and diamonds glittering against black velvet. "Maybe this necklace will finally make you look like you belong in this room." There was a beat of silence. Then a few guests laughed. Awkward, uncertain laughter, the kind people offer when they aren't sure if they've just witnessed a joke or a cruelty. Richard laughed too, loudly, to signal that it had definitely been a joke. Vanessa, across the room, did not laugh. She smiled, slowly, because she knew what was coming next. Clara looked at the necklace. She did not reach for it. She did not gasp. She simply looked at it, and to anyone watching closely, something extraordinary happened on her face. It was not hurt, it was not embarrassment, it was recognition. Because Clara Voss knew that necklace, not that specific piece, but the design. She knew every curve of it, every setting, every proportion, because a version of it had been sketched by her mother on a napkin 30 years ago and refined by Clara's own hand into one of Oraline Mason's most celebrated collections. And this necklace, the one glittering in Daniel's hand, was wrong. The clasp was the wrong shape. The genuine Oraline clasp had a specific hidden mechanism that had never been publicly copied because it was manufactured in a single facility under conditions Clara herself had designed. This clasp was a cheap approximation. The setting of the center stone was off by a degree that no untrained eye would ever notice, but which screamed at Clara like a siren. And when Daniel, still performing, flipped open the small authentication card tucked into the lid of the box, Clara saw in an instant that the certificate used a format Oraline Mason had discontinued 18 months ago. The necklace was fake, a counterfeit, carrying the name of the company she had built with her own 2 hands. For 3 long seconds, Clara said nothing. The room waited. Daniel, mistaking her silence for shock and shame, felt a surge of triumph. This was going even better than he'd hoped. She was speechless, humbled, small. "Well," Daniel said, his voice light with false generosity, "aren't you going to say thank you?" Clara raised her eyes from the necklace and looked at her husband. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's a very interesting piece." Something in the way she said the word interesting made Daniel's smile falter just slightly, but he recovered. He had come here to do something, and he was going to do it. He closed the box, he handed it to her, and then he stepped back, half a pace, and lifted his chin, and prepared to detonate the bomb he had been carrying all evening. "Clara," Daniel said, and now his voice carried a new weight, a rehearsed solemnity. "There's something else I need to say tonight, and I think it's better to say it honestly, in front of the people who care about us, than to hide it." The room went very still. Richard's smile began to fade into confusion. This was not part of the script he had imagined. "Daniel," Richard said quietly. "Son, what are you?" "We've grown apart," Daniel said, talking over his father, addressing the crowd more than his wife. "Clara and I. Everyone here has probably seen it. We come from different worlds. We want different things. And I think the kindest thing I can do for both of us is to stop pretending." A gasp moved through the ballroom. "Daniel?" Clara said softly. "I want a divorce, Clara," Daniel said, and he said it loud enough that every person in the room heard it clearly. "I think it's time we separate." The silence that followed was total. 200 people held their breath. Waiters froze. The band members glanced at one another. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass was set down on a table with a soft clink that sounded in the silence like a gunshot. And then, slowly, all eyes turned to Clara. They were waiting for her to break, to cry, to beg, to fly into a rage or collapse into humiliation. Everyone in that room had watched enough scenes of public heartbreak to know how they were supposed to go. The wife weeps, the husband looks noble and sad, the crowd murmurs sympathy, and the evening ends in delicious scandal. But Clara Voss did none of those things. She stood perfectly still, the fake necklace in its box resting in her hands, and she looked at Daniel with an expression that was almost impossibly calm. Richard finally found his voice. "Daniel, this is madness," he hissed, grabbing his son's arm. "Not here, not tonight. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "It looks honest, Dad," Daniel said, shaking him off. Across the room, Vanessa took a slow sip of champagne to hide her smile. And still, Clara said nothing. She simply watched. And in her stillness, there was something that began, very slowly, to unnerve the crowd. A weeping woman they could understand, a furious woman they could understand. But this quiet, this unshakable calm in the face of public destruction, this was something else entirely. It felt less like the end of a woman and more like the beginning of something none of them could see yet. Daniel felt it too. That flicker of unease returned, stronger now. He had expected tears. He had wanted tears. Her calm was ruining the picture he had built in his head. "You don't have anything to say?" he demanded, and there was an edge of frustration in his voice now. "Nothing at all?" Clara looked down at the necklace one more time. Then she looked back up at Daniel. "I have one question," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in that silent ballroom, it carried to every corner. "Before I answer you," Clara said, "may I have the necklace authenticated?" For a moment, no one understood the question. It seemed absurd. Her husband had just publicly asked for a divorce, and she was asking about jewelry. Daniel laughed. It burst out of him, sharp and mocking. "Are you serious?" he said. "I just told you our marriage is over, and you want to check the necklace?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "It's real, Clara," Daniel snapped. "It's a genuine Oraline Mason piece. It cost more than most people in this room make in a year. What, do you think I'd give you a fake?" He said it as a joke, expecting laughter. He got none, because Clara was still watching him with those calm, steady eyes, and something about her certainty was beginning to make the wealthier, more knowledgeable guests in the room shift uncomfortably. Richard stepped forward, his pride wounded on multiple fronts now. "It's authentic," Richard said firmly. "I saw the certificate myself. Oraline Mason does not make mistakes, and neither does my son. This is exactly the kind of graceless behavior I would expect from—" "Richard," Clara interrupted, gently but firmly. "Do you love this company? Oraline Mason?" Richard blinked, thrown off. Of course. It represents everything everything you've ever aspired to," Clara finished for him. "Yes, I know. You've told me before. You've spent years trying to get a meeting with them. You keep their catalog in your study. You once told Daniel that if you could sit down with the person who runs Oraline Mason, you could die a happy man." Richard's face went pale. He had said all of those things, but he had never said them to Clara. He had said them to Daniel, in private, years ago. "How do you?" he began. But Clara had already turned away from him. She reached into her clutch and drew out the small black box she had brought downstairs, not the box Daniel had given her, her own. "I'd like to call someone," she said to the room. "Someone who can settle this in 5 minutes. A man named Marcus Bell. He happens to be the senior forensic appraiser for Oraline Mason, and he happens to be in this hotel tonight." A ripple of confusion and interest spread through the crowd. Daniel's laugh had died in his throat. "How?" he said slowly. "Would you know Oraline Mason's forensic appraiser?" Clara looked at him, and for the first time all evening, the faintest hint of something sharp appeared beneath her calm, like a blade beneath still water. "Daniel," she said quietly, "there's a great deal you don't know. About that necklace, about your father's business, and about me." "About you?" Daniel scoffed, though his voice had lost its confidence. "You're a designer. You work at a firm downtown. You come home at 6 and make tea and read books. There's nothing to know about you, Clara. That's the whole point. That's why this doesn't work." The cruelty of it landed hard, even on the crowd. A few guests looked away, embarrassed for him or for her, or for themselves for being there to witness it. But Clara did not flinch. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I do make tea. I do read books. And I did come home to you every night for 3 years, hoping you'd become the man I first met at that gallery, the one who talked to me for 2 hours before he ever asked what I did for a living." Daniel's jaw tightened. He remembered that night. He had told his friends afterward that he'd met a woman who was different, real. He couldn't remember when different had turned into embarrassing. "But you're wrong about the rest," Clara continued. "You're wrong about there being nothing to know about me. And you're about to find out exactly how wrong you are." She lifted her phone. "Marcus," she said when the call connected, "it's time. Yes, bring your kit. We're in the main ballroom." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. Then she looked around the room, at all the faces staring at her, at Richard turning gray, at Vanessa's smile finally beginning to falter, at Daniel standing frozen with a fake necklace's box still warm from his hand. "Let's all wait for Mr. Bell," Clara said calmly. "It won't take long." And for the next several minutes, the wealthiest, most powerful people in Upper New York stood in absolute silence, in a ballroom that had been arranged to celebrate a woman they had all underestimated, waiting for a forensic appraiser to arrive and change every single one of their lives. Daniel looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and a cold, creeping fear began to move up his spine because the woman standing in front of him did not look defeated. She looked like she had been waiting 3 years for this exact moment. "Clara," he said, and his voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Daniel," she said gently. "You did. All of it. Every choice was yours. I just stopped stopping you." Near the doors, a figure appeared, a composed man in his 50s carrying a slim silver case. He crossed the ballroom with the unhurried confidence of a man who had authenticated pieces for royalty, and when he reached Clara, he did something that made the entire room gasp. He bowed his head slightly and he said, "Good evening, Miss Voss. I came as fast as I could." Miss Voss. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Voss. Richard Whitmore heard it. His mouth opened. His eyes moved from the appraiser to Clara and back again, and something began to dawn on him. Something so enormous and so impossible that his mind refused to accept it. "Voss," Richard whispered. "Voss. No, that can't be." Clara turned to face the room fully now, and when she spoke, her voice was still quiet, still calm, but it had changed. It carried the weight of everything she had hidden for 3 years. "Marcus," she said, "please examine the necklace my husband gave me tonight and tell everyone here whether it's a genuine Oraline Mason piece." Marcus Bell set his silver case on a nearby table, opened it, and reached for the black velvet box in Clara's hands. And every soul in that ballroom leaned forward, holding their breath, as the quiet wife everyone had underestimated stood at the center of the storm she had let them build, waiting for the truth to come out. Daniel's hands had begun to shake. Vanessa's champagne glass was frozen halfway to her lips. And Richard Whitmore, the man who had worshipped Oraline Mason his entire life, stared at his daughter-in-law with the horrified expression of a man who was just beginning to understand that he had spent 3 years insulting the very person whose approval he had spent his whole life chasing. Marcus lifted the necklace to the light. He turned it once, and then he looked up, straight at Daniel, and the words he was about to say would end one family's illusion of power forever. Marcus Bell held the necklace beneath the chandelier light for a long, deliberate moment. He was not a man who rushed. He had spent 30 years authenticating pieces that had passed through the hands of queens and thieves, and he had learned that the truth revealed itself slowly to those patient enough to look. He turned the necklace over. He ran his thumb along the clasp. He pulled a small jeweler's loop from his case and pressed it to his eye, examining the center stone setting with the focus of a surgeon. The ballroom did not breathe. "Well?" Daniel demanded, and his voice cracked on the single word. "It's real. Tell them it's real." Marcus did not answer him. He was still working. He reached into his silver case and withdrew a small ultraviolet device, the kind used to read the microscopic markings that Aureline Mason embedded in every authentic piece. He passed it over the surface of the necklace, once, twice, 3 times. Then he lowered the light. And he lowered the necklace. And when he looked up, he did not look at Daniel. He looked at Clara. "Miss Voss," he said quietly, "this is not an authentic Aureline Mason piece." For a moment, the words simply hung in the air, refusing to land. Then the ballroom erupted. It was not a loud eruption. It was worse than that. It was 200 wealthy, powerful people murmuring all at once, a low, rising tide of disbelief that swept across the room like a wave pulling back from the shore before something terrible arrives. "It's a counterfeit," Marcus continued, and now he raised his voice just enough to carry. "A skilled one, but a counterfeit nonetheless. The clasp mechanism is a replica. The microstamp is absent. And the center stone, while genuine, is set at an angle that our craftsmen would never permit. Whoever made this knew our designs well enough to imitate them, but imitation is all it is." Daniel's face had gone the color of old paper. "That's impossible," he said. No, you're wrong. I paid a fortune for that. I bought it from a private dealer, a reputable one. He showed me the certificate. The certificate," Marcus said, and here his tone sharpened, "is the most interesting part." He set the necklace down on the velvet and lifted the small authentication card that had come tucked inside the lid of the box. He examined it under his light, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "This certificate," he said slowly, "uses an authentication format that Aureline Mason discontinued 18 months ago. But that alone wouldn't tell you much. What's remarkable is the watermark pattern. It's forged, of course, but it's forged in a very specific way, a way I've seen before." He looked up. "Miss Voss," he said, "this is the same forgery pattern we flagged in the Hargrove case and the Delmont case." The color drained from Richard Whitmore's face so fast that a woman standing beside him reached out to steady him. Because Richard knew those names. Hargrove and Delmont were not jewelry buyers. They were financial partners. They were companies. They were, specifically, 2 of the shell entities that Richard Whitmore had used over the past 2 years to secure a series of enormous bank loans. Loans he had justified by inflating the value of his company's assets. And a significant portion of those assets, the ones he had presented to the banks as proof of his wealth, were luxury pieces. Art, jewelry, watches, Aureline Mason pieces. Richard's legs nearly gave out. "Dad?" Daniel said, catching the change in his father's face. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the necklace on the velvet as if it were a snake that had just uncoiled itself in front of 200 witnesses. Clara watched all of this with a stillness that was almost unbearable. She had known. Of course she had known. Her forensic team had traced the forgery pattern months ago, long before tonight, and she had simply been waiting for the moment when it would surface in the open, where no one could bury it. "Marcus," she said gently, "thank you. That will be all for now." Marcus inclined his head, closed his silver case, and stepped back. But he did not leave the room. He took up a position near the wall, the way a man does when he knows his testimony will be needed again. The murmuring of the crowd had risen now into something closer to open alarm. Business partners who had come to celebrate a Whitmore triumph were suddenly leaning together, whispering urgently, some of them already reaching for their phones. Because everyone in that room understood money, and everyone in that room had just heard the word forgery attached to the name Whitmore in a way that would be impossible to unhear. Daniel turned to Clara, and his mind was scrambling, clawing for solid ground. "Okay," he said, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. "Okay, so the dealer sold me a fake. That's on him, not me. That's fraud, and I'll deal with it. But it doesn't change anything about us, Clara. It doesn't change what I said. We're still—" "Daniel," Clara's voice cut through his like a wire through soft clay. "Stop talking." He stopped. He actually stopped. And the fact that he obeyed her, instantly, without thinking, sent a fresh wave of unease through him, because he had never once obeyed her. In 3 years, Clara had never given him an order. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded anything. And now, with a single word, She had silenced him in front of everyone he wanted to impress. "You asked me a question tonight," Clara said. "You asked me for a divorce, and you asked it in front of all these people because you wanted an audience. You wanted them to see you as the reasonable one, the patient husband, the man who finally let go of the wife who didn't fit." She took a slow step toward him. "So let's give them their audience," she said. "But let's tell the whole story, not just the part you rehearsed." Vanessa Cross, from her position by the wall, finally set her champagne glass down on a passing tray. Her smile was gone. Something in Clara's voice had reached across the room and touched a cold place in her stomach that she couldn't quite name yet. "Clara," Richard said suddenly, finding his voice, desperate now to seize control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "Whatever your grievance with my son, this is not the place. These are important people. You are humiliating this family in front of—" "Your family," Clara said, turning to him, "has been humiliating me for 3 years, Richard. Quietly. At dinner tables, in small comments, in the way you introduced me to your friends as, quote, Daniel's little wife. I never said a word. Do you know why?" Richard's mouth worked, but nothing came out. "Because I was waiting," Clara said, "to see if any of you, even one of you, would ever treat me with respect when you thought I had nothing to offer, when you thought I was no one." She looked from Richard to Daniel and back again. "You had 3 years, and not one of you passed the test." "Test?" Daniel said. "What test? What are you talking about? Clara, you're a designer. I am not a designer, Daniel." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "I mean, I am," Clara continued, her voice steady. "I do design. It's the part of the work I love most. But I am not, and I have never been, a mid-level employee at a firm downtown. That was a story I let you believe because I wanted to know something that money can't buy and status can't fake." She reached into her clutch again, and this time she drew out a slim leather folder. She handed it, not to Daniel, but to a man standing near the front of the crowd, a silver-haired attorney named Gerald Frost, who had been quietly present all evening and whom most guests had assumed was simply another business associate. Gerald opened the folder. He cleared his throat, and he read, in the clear, carrying voice of a man who had delivered devastating news in courtrooms for 4 decades. "For the record, and before these witnesses," Gerald said, "I represent the interests of Miss Clara Voss. I wish to formally confirm, with documentation available to any party who requests it, that Miss Clara Voss is the founder, chief executive officer, and majority owner of Oraline Mason." The ballroom did not erupt this time. It went utterly, completely silent. It was the silence of 200 people whose understanding of reality had just been picked up and turned upside down all at once. Richard Whitmore made a sound. It was not a word. It was something between a gasp and a moan, the sound of a man watching his entire life's fantasy collapse and rebuild itself into a nightmare in the space of a single breath. Oraline Mason. The company he had worshipped, the company whose approval he had chased for years, the company he kept a catalog of in his study like scripture, the company whose leadership he had told his son, in a moment of naked longing, that he would give anything just to sit across a table from. And its founder, its owner, its chief executive, had been sitting across his table every Sunday for 3 years, quietly passing him the salt while he called her Daniel's little wife. "No," Richard whispered. "No, that's a mistake. That's some kind of trick. She makes tea. She reads books. I also make decisions that move markets," Clara said, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "I employ 11,000 people across 4 continents. I sit on a board that manages assets larger than every fortune in this room combined, and I have done all of it while married to your son, who to this day has never once asked me a single question about my day that he actually waited to hear the answer to." Daniel had not moved. He was staring at his wife as though she had transformed into a stranger in front of him, and in a sense, she had. The woman he had spent 3 years shrinking, dismissing, and finally discarding had never existed. She had been a costume Clara wore, and now she had taken it off, and beneath it stood a woman more powerful than anyone he had ever met. "You're lying," Daniel said, but his voice had no conviction in it. "You'd have to be lying. There's no way. I would have known. I would have—" You would have known, Clara agreed, if you had ever looked. But you didn't look, Daniel. You looked at me and you saw someone who made you seem generous by comparison. You looked at me and you saw a background against which you could shine. You never once saw me. She turned then, slowly, and let her eyes travel across the crowd until they found Vanessa Cross. "And you," Clara said. Vanessa flinched. "You've been meeting my husband in the Carlisle suite of this very hotel for the past 8 months," Clara said, her voice carrying with terrible clarity. "Suite 1420, usually on Tuesdays, sometimes Thursdays. You told him you loved him. You told him he deserved better. You told him that a woman like me was holding him back from the life he was meant to have." Vanessa's face had gone bloodless. You can't. "I own a controlling interest in the management company that operates the Grand Leora Hotel," Clara said simply. "I don't need to spy on anyone, Vanessa. Information comes to me. It's one of the many things that happens when you spend 30 years building something instead of chasing someone else's." A woman near Vanessa physically stepped away from her, as if proximity itself were now dangerous. Vanessa looked at Daniel, and for the first time all evening, the mask slipped completely off her face, revealing not love, not even affection, but raw calculation, the look of a gambler watching her chips get swept off the table. "Daniel," she hissed, "say something. Do something." But Daniel had nothing to say. He was drowning, and he knew it, and there was no one in that room reaching out to pull him up. His father was collapsing into himself. His mistress was already looking at him, the way you look at a car you're about to abandon on the side of the road. And his wife, the woman he had just publicly humiliated, stood in the center of it all, calm and untouched, holding the fate of his entire family in her hands. "Clara," Daniel said, and his voice broke into something small and pleading. "Clara, please. Let's talk about this. Privately. This is between us. We don't need to do this here, in front of—" "You chose here," Clara reminded him gently. "You chose in front of. Remember? You wanted witnesses. Well?" She spread her hands slightly, taking in the room. "Here are your witnesses." And in that moment, something inside Daniel Whitmore finally cracked all the way open. Not his pride, that had already shattered. Something deeper. The first true understanding of what he had done and what he had thrown away and who he had thrown it at. But even then, even in that moment of dawning horror, the old habits reasserted themselves. Because Daniel Whitmore had been raised by Richard Whitmore, and Richard Whitmore had taught his son that when you are losing, you attack. "You planned this," Daniel said, and his voice hardened, grasping at anger, because anger felt safer than shame. "You knew I was going to ask for a divorce tonight, and you set all of this up. You wanted to destroy me. You wanted to destroy my father. This whole thing, the appraiser, the lawyer, it was all a trap. You've been playing me this entire time." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Daniel," she said quietly, "listen to yourself. You cheated on me for 8 months. You planned to end our marriage in front of 200 people to humiliate me. You handed me a counterfeit necklace and told me it might finally make me look like I belonged. And now that it's all come apart, your first instinct is to accuse me of being the villain." She shook her head slowly. "That," she said, "is the whole problem. That has always been the whole problem. You cannot imagine a version of events in which you are not the wronged party, even now, even here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Daniel heard it, and it landed like a slap. These were his people, his father's friends, his social world, and they were turning one by one, their faces closing against him. Richard, meanwhile, had found a chair and lowered himself into it, his hand pressed to his chest. But it was not his son's marriage he was thinking about. His mind, even now, even shattered, had gone to the only thing it truly cared about: the money. "The loans," Richard whispered, to no one. "If the pieces are counterfeit, then the collateral is worthless, and if the collateral is worthless, then the loans are, oh God, oh God." Gerald Frost, the attorney, stepped forward again, and his voice was gentle but merciless. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, I think it's only fair to inform you that Oraline Mason's Forensic Division has been cooperating with a financial oversight inquiry for several months. The counterfeit pieces used as collateral in your loan applications were flagged as part of that inquiry. Your necklace tonight simply confirmed a pattern we already suspected. Richard looked up at him with the hollow eyes of a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. "You're saying," Richard managed, "you're saying the banks, they know, or they're going to know." "I'm saying," Gerald replied, "that you should speak to your own attorneys, soon, tonight if possible." The whispering in the crowd sharpened into something urgent now. A man in an expensive suit turned to the person beside him and said, loud enough to be heard, "If Whitmore Holdings is built on forged collateral, then every partnership we have with them is exposed." And the person beside him nodded grimly and reached for his phone and stepped away toward the exit. And that, more than anything, was the moment the evening truly turned. Because the guests had come to celebrate the Whitmores, and now they were fleeing them. One by one, then in small clusters, the wealthy and the powerful began to peel away from the center of the room, drifting toward the doors, dialing their advisors, distancing themselves from a name that had just become radioactive. Daniel watched them go, and the enormity of it began to reach him at last. It was not just his marriage, it was everything. The whole gleaming edifice his family had built, the connections, the reputation, the borrowed grandeur, all of it was dissolving in real time, and he was standing at the center of the dissolution, holding the box of a fake necklace. "Clara," Daniel said, and now there were no more tactics left in him, no more anger, no more accusations, just a man, stripped bare. "Clara, please, whatever I did, whatever I said, I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were." And Clara, who had waited 3 years for an apology, felt something in her chest that surprised her, not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to grief, because his apology had proven her point more perfectly than any speech ever could. "You didn't know who I was," she repeated softly. "And that's exactly it, Daniel. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry for who you did it to. If I really had been a mid-level designer at a downtown firm, you wouldn't be apologizing right now. You'd be finishing your speech. You'd be walking out that door with Vanessa on your arm, feeling proud of yourself for being honest." She stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear the next words, though she said them clearly enough that the nearest guests caught them too. "The wealth was never the test," Clara said. "Your character was, and you failed it 100 times over in 100 small moments, long before you ever knew my name." Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind him, Vanessa had made a decision. She gathered her clutch, lifted her chin, and began to walk toward the exit, quickly, without a backward glance at the man she had spent 8 months encouraging toward this exact catastrophe. "Vanessa," Daniel called after her. "Vanessa, wait, where are you?" "Don't," Vanessa said, not even turning around. "Just don't. This isn't what I signed up for." "This isn't what you—" Daniel stared at her back in disbelief. "You planned this with me. You told me to do it. You told me she was holding me back." Vanessa paused at the edge of the crowd, and when she turned, her face was cold and clear. All the false warmth burned away. "I told you what you wanted to hear, Daniel," she said. "That's what I do. That was always what this was. You were a man with a name and money and a certain kind of future, and I made a bet on you." Her eyes flicked around the emptying ballroom, at the fleeing guests, at the ruined evening. "And I just lost that bet. So, goodbye." And she walked out, her heels clicking across the marble, and she did not look back. And Daniel watched the woman for whom he had detonated his entire life disappear through the doors without so much as a flicker of regret. The silence she left behind was crushing. Daniel turned slowly back to Clara, and there was nothing left in his face now. No arrogance, no anger, no performance. Just a man standing in the wreckage of choices he could not take back, beginning to understand that the woman in front of him had been the best thing in his life, and that he had not merely lost her, he had spent 3 years actively destroying her, and she had let him, because she had needed to know the truth about what kind of man she had married. Now they both knew. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Now?" Clara said. She glanced at Gerald Frost, who gave a small professional nod. Now the divorce you asked for will proceed, cleanly. My attorneys will contact yours. You'll find I'm not interested in taking anything from you, Daniel. I never was. I don't need your money. I never needed your money." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "That was rather the entire point that you never understood." And my father?" Daniel asked. "The company? The loans?" Clara's expression didn't change. "That's between your father, his creditors, and the law. I won't be helping him this time." She paused. "Do you know, Daniel, that for 3 years I quietly stabilized your father's business? When Whitmore Holdings nearly collapsed 2 years ago, do you remember? The contracts that saved it, the investors who suddenly appeared, the loan that got restructured at the last minute." Richard from his chair lifted his head slowly. "That was me," Clara said. "All of it. I did it quietly, through intermediaries, because I didn't want recognition. I did it because your father was family, and because I hoped, foolishly, that one day this family might become something worth belonging to." She looked at Richard, and something in her voice softened with a sorrow that was real. "I protected you, Richard, for years, without you ever knowing, and you spent that entire time thinking I was beneath you." Richard stared at her, and the full, unbearable weight of it settled onto him. Every dismissive comment, every condescending introduction, every time he had looked at the quiet woman his son had married and thought, privately, what a disappointment. And all the while, she had been the invisible hand keeping his empire from crumbling. "You," Richard croaked, "you saved us, and I." "And you never even saw me," Clara finished. "Yes." She turned away from him. She could not bear to watch a proud man break, even a man who had earned it. There was no pleasure in this for her. She had built her whole life on the idea that real value did not need to shout, and now, standing in this ruined ballroom surrounded by fleeing guests and shattered men, she found that being proven right felt nothing at all like she had once imagined it would. It felt lonely. "I'm going to go now," Clara said quietly. She set the black velvet box with its counterfeit necklace down on the table beside Marcus's silver case. "Keep the necklace, Daniel, or don't. It's evidence now either way. Mr. Frost will be in touch." She took a step toward the doors. "Clara." Daniel's voice stopped her. "Clara, please, just tell me, was any of it real? The 3 years? Was any of it real to you?" Clara stood with her back to him for a long moment, and when she answered, she did not turn around. "It was real to me, Daniel," she said. "That's what makes it so sad. It was real to me the entire time. I loved you. Not the name, not the future, not the family. You. The man I met at that gallery, the one who asked me about the books I was reading and actually listened to the answer. I kept waiting for him to come back." She paused. "He never did." And then Clara Voss walked toward the doors of the ballroom, past the whispering remnants of the crowd, past the man who had worshipped her company without ever knowing he'd married its owner, past the wreckage of an evening that had been designed to humiliate her and had instead exposed everyone else. She did not walk quickly. She did not walk in triumph. She walked the way she had always moved through the world. Quietly. Certainly. With the unhurried grace of a woman who had never needed anyone's permission to know her own worth. Behind her, Daniel Whitmore sank slowly into a chair beside his father, and the two men sat in silence in the emptying room, surrounded by the ghost of a celebration, beginning the long, cold understanding of everything they had lost. And near the wall, Marcus Bell quietly closed his silver case, glanced once at the retreating figure of the woman he had served for over a decade, and thought to himself that in all his years of authenticating precious things, he had never seen anything as genuine or as underestimated as Clara Voss. The doors of the ballroom swung shut behind her, and the illusion of the Whitmore family, an illusion built on borrowed money, forged certificates, and the labor of a woman they had all been too proud to see, was finished. The morning after came, as mornings after always do, with a brutal clarity that the night had been merciful enough to hide. By 8 o'clock, the story was everywhere. It had started as whispers among the guests who had fled the ballroom, and by dawn those whispers had become phone calls, and the phone calls had become the kind of news that moves through the financial world like fire through dry grass. Whitmore Holdings, forged collateral, counterfeit assets pledged against tens of millions in loans, and at the center of it all, a name that made every headline irresistible. Aureline Mason, the luxury empire, and its secret owner, Clara Voss, the quiet wife who had been humiliated at her own birthday party by a husband who had no idea who she was. Richard Whitmore did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, surrounded by the catalogs and the framed photographs and the borrowed grandeur of a life he had spent 30 years constructing, and he watched his phone light up with call after call after call. His attorney, his banker, his business partners, and with each call, the walls of his world moved a little closer together. "Richard, we need to talk about the Meridian loan." That was his banker, a man named Foster, who had been friendly for 15 years and was suddenly, terrifyingly, not. "Richard, I'm going to be honest with you. We can't be associated with this. We're pulling out of the joint venture." That was Howard Price, the man who just hours earlier had shaken his hand and said, "For family, only the best." "Richard, you need to prepare yourself. If those appraisals were fraudulent, and it looks like they were, you're not just facing default, you're facing criminal exposure." That was his attorney, and that was the call that finally broke him. He set the phone down. He looked around his study, and for the first time in his adult life, Richard Whitmore understood that money, the thing he had worshipped above all else, above honesty, above kindness, above the daughter-in-law who had quietly saved him, offered no protection at all when it turned out to have been built on a lie. Across town, in a much smaller apartment, Daniel Whitmore was learning the same lesson from a different angle. He had not gone home the night before. He couldn't. Home was the apartment he had shared with Clara, and the thought of walking into those rooms, of seeing her books on the shelf and her tea in the cupboard, and the small ordinary evidence of the life he had thrown away, was more than he could bear. So he had checked into a hotel, a lesser one, and he had lain awake all night replaying the evening in an endless, torturous loop. "Maybe this necklace will finally make you look like you belong in this room." He heard himself say it over and over. He watched Clara's face over and over, that terrible calm, that recognition. He watched Marcus Bell lift the necklace to the light. He heard the lawyer's voice, founder, chief executive officer, and majority owner of Aureline Mason. He watched Vanessa walk out without a backward glance, and each time the loop completed, it began again, and each time it hurt exactly as much as the first. At 9 a.m, Daniel's phone rang. It was his father. "Have you seen it?" Richard's voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. "Have you seen what they're saying?" "I've seen it, Dad." "They're going to destroy us, Daniel. The banks are calling the loans. Foster says if the collateral was fraudulent, they can accelerate everything, all of it, due immediately. We don't have that kind of liquidity. Nobody has that kind of liquidity." A ragged breath. "We're going to lose everything." Daniel closed his eyes. "I know." "You have to talk to her," Richard said suddenly, and there was a desperate, grasping quality in his voice that made Daniel's stomach turn. "Clara, you have to talk to Clara. She saved us before. She can, if she just says a word to the banks, if she vouches for the assets, if she—" "Dad." "She's your wife, Daniel." "She's not my wife anymore, Dad." Daniel's voice cracked. "I ended it, in front of 200 people. I ended it and I called her nothing and I gave her a fake necklace and told her she didn't belong. Why on earth would she help us now?" There was a long silence on the line. "Because," Richard said finally, and his voice had shrunk to something small and pleading, "because we're family." And Daniel, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed with his head in his hands, laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a man who has just understood something he should have understood years ago. "We were never family to her, Dad," Daniel said quietly. "We were a test, and we failed." He hung up. Meanwhile, Clara Voss had gone to work. Not because she needed to, because it was Monday, and because in 20 years of building Aureline Mason, she had never once let a personal storm keep her from her responsibilities, and she was not about to start now. She arrived at the company's headquarters at 7, as she always did, and she moved through the lobby with the same quiet certainty she carried everywhere. And if any of her employees knew that the woman in the news was their chief executive, they were too well trained and too fond of her to show it. At her desk, her assistant Priya was waiting, and Priya had the particular expression of a woman who has been fielding phone calls for 3 hours. "How bad?" Clara asked, settling into her chair. "The press wants a statement," Priya said. "All of them, everyone, and the legal team wants to know how much you want to cooperate with the fraud inquiry. And," she hesitated, "there have been calls from the Whitmore side, their attorney, and Richard himself twice, and Daniel." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What did Daniel say?" "He didn't leave a message. He just held the line for a while, and then he hung up." Clara nodded slowly. She turned her chair toward the window and she looked out at the city, and she thought about the strange, hollow feeling that had settled into her chest since the night before. She had spent 3 years waiting for the truth to surface. She had spent 3 years quietly enduring, quietly protecting, quietly hoping. And now the waiting was over, and the truth was out, and the men who had wronged her were watching their world collapse, and she felt no joy in it. None at all. "Priya," she said, "the fraud inquiry? What's my actual exposure? What does Orlin Mason owe here?" Priya consulted her tablet. "Legally? Nothing. The counterfeit pieces were made by a third-party dealer using our forged authentication. We're the victim of the forgery, not the source. In fact, our cooperation with the inquiry protects our brand and strengthens our position against future counterfeits. The legal team is actually thrilled." She paused. "The forgery ring that supplied Whitmore Holdings, we've been tracking them for over a year. This exposes them. It's a good outcome for us." "And the Whitmores?" "The Whitmores," Priya said carefully, "are finished with or without us. The forged collateral was their doing. The inflated loan applications were their doing. We didn't cause any of it. We just happened to be the name they forged." She looked up. "Clara, I have to say this, because someone should. You don't owe them anything. Not a statement, not a phone call, not a shred of help. After what Daniel did to you last night, in public, in front of everyone, no one on this earth would blame you for letting them burn." "I know," Clara said softly. "But?" Priya asked, because she had known Clara long enough to hear the word hanging in the air. Clara didn't answer right away. She stood, and she walked to the far wall of her office, where a single framed image hung. It was not a photograph. It was a sketch, a rough, beautiful sketch of a necklace drawn in pencil on the back of a diner napkin, preserved now behind museum glass. Her mother's first design, the one that had started everything. "When I was 9 years old," Clara said, "my mother and I were in a jewelry store, a real one, a fancy one, the kind we could never afford. She was picking up a repair, a small thing, the only nice piece she owned, and it had a broken clasp. And the man behind the counter, he took one look at us, at our clothes, at the cheap little necklace, and he decided we didn't belong there. He was rude, dismissive. He made us wait while he helped wealthier customers who came in after us. He treated my mother like she was nothing." Priya was very still. "And my mother didn't argue," Clara continued. "She didn't make a scene. She just waited, patiently. And when he finally handed her the necklace, she looked at him and she said, 'One day I'm going to build something so beautiful that people like you will spend your whole lives trying to be near it. And you still won't understand the first thing about what makes it valuable.'" Clara smiled faintly at the sketch, and then she took my hand and we walked out, and she never went back. "And she built it," Priya said quietly. "She started it," Clara said. "She died before it became what it is. I finished it. For her." She turned from the sketch. "Do you understand why I hid my name, Priya? Everyone always thought it was some elaborate test of Daniel. And it was, partly. But the deeper reason is my mother. She taught me that real value doesn't need to shout, that your work should speak before your name does. I hid my name because I wanted, just once, to be treated by someone the way that jeweler treated my mother, and to find out if that person could rise above it, if they could see me, the real me, not the title, not the money, me." She sat back down at her desk. "Daniel didn't see me," she said. "Richard didn't see me. They failed, exactly like that jeweler failed. And you're right. I don't owe them anything." She folded her hands. "But here's the thing my mother understood that took me 30 years to learn. The point was never to become the jeweler. The point was never to look down on the people who looked down on me. The point was to be better than that, to be the kind of person who doesn't measure others by what they own. She met Priya's eyes. If I destroy the Whitmores out of revenge, then I become Richard, and I would rather lose everything than become Richard. Priya was quiet for the long moment. So what do you want to do? She asked finally. I want to do nothing, Clara said simply. I'm not going to help them, Priya. I stopped protecting them the moment Daniel opened that box. But I'm not going to destroy them either. I'm going to let the consequences of their own choices land exactly where they belong. The banks called the loans because the collateral was fraudulent, not because of anything I did. The partners are leaving because of the fraud, not because of me. I'm simply, finally, out of the way. She exhaled. For 3 years, I stood between the Whitmores and the truth. I'm just going to stop standing there. That's all. And that, in the end, was the most devastating thing Clara Voss could have done. Not vengeance, not a public takedown, just the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of the invisible protection that had been holding a rotten structure upright. She simply stepped aside. And the structure, deprived of the woman it had never known it was leaning on, began to fall. By Wednesday, the first bank had formally accelerated its loan. By Thursday, 2 more had followed. By Friday, Whitmore Holdings had filed for emergency protection from its creditors, and the news of it ran alongside old photographs of Richard Whitmore at charity galas, smiling in tailored suits, the very image of a wealth that had turned out to be a mirage. Richard sat in a conference room with his attorneys and watched his life's work be pulled apart line by line, asset by asset. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, was not the money. It was the realization, arriving slowly and mercilessly, that he had held salvation in his own home for 3 years and had thrown it away with both hands. Clara had saved him once, quietly, when he never knew it. She could have saved him again, and the only reason she wouldn't was because of how his family had treated her. His fall was not bad luck. It was a bill, and it had finally come due. For Daniel, the collapse was quieter but no less complete. His name, the Whitmore name, the thing he had prized above all else, the thing that had made him feel entitled to look down on his own wife, became a liability overnight. Doors that had always opened for him closed. Friends who had always laughed at his jokes stopped returning his calls. The social world that had defined his entire identity simply, quietly, let him go. And in the middle of all of it, Daniel found himself doing something he had not done in years. He found himself thinking about Clara, not about what she owned, not about Orlin Mason, but about her. The small things, the way she hummed while she made tea in the mornings, the way she read 3 books at once, leaving them open face down all over the apartment, the way she always remembered the names of waiters and doormen and asked about their children, the way she had looked at him that first night at the gallery when he was still a man worth loving before he became a man worth leaving. He had had all of that, and he had traded it for a woman in a wine-colored dress who walked out the moment the money disappeared. On Saturday, 6 days after the party, Daniel did something he knew he had no right to do. He went to see Clara. He didn't go to her office. He wouldn't have gotten past the lobby. He went instead to a small bookshop in the old part of the city, a quiet, dusty place with creaking floors and a cat that slept in the window. It was the bookshop where he had first met her, 3 years ago, at a small gallery event held in the back room, and it was, he knew, the one place in the world she still went on Saturday mornings, alone, to browse and to think. He found her in the poetry section, a book open in her hands. She didn't look up, but she knew he was there. She had always known when he was near, even when he hadn't deserved that kind of attention. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel," she said quietly, turning a page. "I know," he said. "I know I shouldn't. I needed to say something to you, and I couldn't do it through the lawyers. I couldn't do it on the phone. I needed to say it to your face." Clara finally looked up, and there was no anger in her eyes, which somehow made it harder. Just a tired, gentle patience. "All right," she said. "Say it." Daniel opened his mouth. He had rehearsed this 100 times in the past 6 days. He had a whole speech prepared about the pressure his father had put on him, about how he'd been confused, about how Vanessa had manipulated him, about how if he'd only known who Clara really was, everything would have been different. And standing there in the bookshop where he had fallen in love with her, he realized that every single word of that speech was exactly the problem. So he threw it away. "I'm not going to make excuses," Daniel said instead, and his voice shook. "I had a whole speech about my father, about Vanessa, about the money, and it's all garbage, because none of it changes the one thing that's actually true, which is that I stopped seeing you years ago, and I don't even fully understand why. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara, and somewhere along the way I decided you weren't enough, and I have spent this entire week trying to figure out what was wrong with me, that I could look at you every single day and see nothing." Clara said nothing, but something flickered in her expression. "And here's the thing that's killing me," Daniel went on, the words spilling out now. "It's not that you're rich. I swear to God, Clara, I don't care about Oraline Mason. I don't care about the money. If anything, the money makes it worse, because now I'll never be able to prove to you or to myself that I could have loved you without it. That chance is gone. I threw it away before I even knew I had it." He wiped his eyes roughly. "You gave me 3 years to be the man you met in this bookshop, and I wasted every one of them. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Not because of who you turned out to be, because of who I turned out to be." For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. She closed the book of poetry in her hands and held it against her chest, and she looked at the man she had married, and she felt the strange grief again, stronger now, the grief of watching someone finally become the person you needed them to be, 3 years too late. "That," she said softly, "is the first honest thing you've said to me in a very long time." Daniel's breath caught. "Does that mean, is there any way that we could—" "No," Clara said, gently, but without hesitation. The word landed, and Daniel absorbed it, and to his credit, he did not argue. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't think you do," Clara said. "Not yet. So let me explain it, because you deserve to understand, and because I need to say it out loud." She set the book back on the shelf. "You just told me you're sorry for who you turned out to be, and I believe you. I think right now, in this moment, you mean it more than you've ever meant anything. But Daniel, a person's character isn't what they feel in the wreckage. It's what they do when everything is fine, when no one is watching, when there's no test, no consequence, no billionaire wife hiding in plain sight." She stepped a little closer. "For 3 years, everything was fine," she said. "And when everything was fine, you chose to look down on me. You chose Vanessa. You chose to plan a public humiliation. You made 100 small choices in 100 ordinary moments, and every one of those choices told me exactly who you are when you think there's nothing at stake." Her voice was soft, but it did not waver. "The man standing in front of me right now, the one who's sorry, who sees me, who understands what he lost. That man only exists because you lost everything. And I can't build a life on a man who only becomes good after the walls come down." Daniel stood there, and the truth of it settled over him, heavy and final and undeniable. "You should have valued me before you knew my name," Clara said. "That was the whole test, Daniel, and I know now that it's not a test you can pass late. That's not how it works. The value has to come first, before the reveal, before the reward. It has to come when there's nothing in it for you at all." She offered him a small, sad smile. "That's what makes it real." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood now. Finally, fully, he understood. And understanding it did not fix anything. It only made the loss complete. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice barely holding together, "I did love you. At the start. In this bookshop. The man you met here, he loved you. He was real." "I know," Clara said, and her eyes were wet now too. "That's the part that breaks my heart, Daniel. He was real. I met him, and then I watched him disappear a little more every year, and I kept waiting for him to come back, and he never did." She picked up her bag. "Take care of yourself, and take care of your father, if you can. He's going to need someone, and it's going to have to be you." She moved toward the door. "Clara," Daniel said. She paused. Thank you, he said, for 3 years. For saving my father, even when we didn't deserve it. For all the things you did that we never even knew about. I don't know how to make it right. I don't think I can. But thank you. Clara looked at him one last time, and in her expression there was no hatred, no triumph, no lingering love. Just a kind of clear, hard-won peace. Goodbye, Daniel, she said. And she walked out of the bookshop where they had met into the bright, ordinary morning, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her anymore, only the closing of a chapter she had carried for far too long. Daniel stood alone among the poetry books, in the quiet, with the sleeping cat in the window, and he understood at last that some doors, once you walk through them the wrong way, never open again. And outside, Clara Voss lifted her face to the morning sun, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt the strange, weightless lightness of a woman who had finally stopped carrying something that was never hers to carry. The weeks that followed did not fall quietly. They fell like an avalanche, and everyone who had ever leaned on the Whitmore name found themselves scrambling to get out from under it before it buried them too. The fraud inquiry, once it had a name and a face and a scandal to feed on, moved with a speed that surprised even the people running it. Investigators who had spent a year quietly tracing the counterfeit ring suddenly had witnesses lining up, because everyone who had done business with Whitmore Holdings wanted to be on record as a victim rather than a partner. The forged authentication certificates that Marcus Bell had recognized that night in the ballroom turned out to be the loose thread that unraveled an entire tapestry. Pull it, and the whole thing came apart. Richard Whitmore learned the full scope of his ruin in a lawyer's conference room on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks after his son's birthday announcement had detonated their lives. "They're not just calling the loans, Richard," his attorney said. His name was Bernard Case, and he had represented Richard for 20 years, and he had never once had to deliver news like this. "The fraud exposure changes everything. When you pledged those pieces as collateral, and the appraisals were forged, that's not a civil matter anymore. That's criminal. Bank fraud, wire fraud, possibly more, depending on what the investigators find in the financials." Richard sat very still. "How bad?" "Prison, Richard. If they can prove you knew the appraisals were fraudulent when you submitted them, we're talking about federal prison." Bernard removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "And the honest truth is, I don't know how we argue you didn't know. You submitted those documents personally. Your signature is on the loan applications. You presented the collateral as genuine." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He was thinking about the dealer, the private dealer who had sold him the counterfeit pieces, the man who had assured him with such confidence that everything was authentic, that the certificates were real, that Richard was getting the deal of a lifetime. "The dealer," Richard said, "Cornelius Vane. He sold me the pieces. He gave me the certificates. He told me they were genuine. He's the one who defrauded me. I was a victim." Bernard was quiet. "Bernard," Richard said, and something cold was creeping into his voice. "Find Cornelius Vane. He can testify that I bought those pieces in good faith. He can prove I didn't know." "Richard," Bernard said slowly, "Cornelius Vane disappeared 4 days ago. His gallery is closed. His accounts are empty. His phone is disconnected. The investigators think he fled the country the moment the news broke." He paused. "And here's the part I need you to hear. Even if we found him, Richard, he wouldn't help you, because there's evidence that you and Vane had an arrangement, that the inflated appraisals weren't just his fraud, that you knew the pieces were worth a fraction of what you claimed, and you both profited from the loans." The silence in the room was absolute. "That's not true," Richard whispered. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Because it was true, wasn't it? Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part of himself he had spent years refusing to look at, Richard had known. He had known the pieces were too cheap. He had known the appraisals were generous beyond reason. He had known, and he had chosen not to ask questions because the loans had kept his empire afloat, and an empire built on borrowed money asks very few questions of its foundation. He had known, and now that knowing was going to cost him everything. "There's one more thing," Bernard said carefully. And I debated whether to even tell you. But you'll find out eventually, so it should come from me." He hesitated. 2 years ago, when Whitmore Holdings nearly collapsed the first time, the restructuring that saved you, the investors who appeared out of nowhere, the loan that got quietly reworked at the last minute. What about it? "I always wondered how it happened," Bernard said. "It never made sense to me. Your position was hopeless, and then suddenly it wasn't. At the time, I assumed you'd pulled off some miracle you didn't want to explain, but now, with everything that's come out." He looked at Richard steadily. "That rescue came through a network of intermediaries that traces back, ultimately, to Aureline Mason, to Clara Voss." Richard's face went slack. "She saved you, Richard," Bernard said quietly. 2 years ago, anonymously. She restructured the very debt that's destroying you now, and she did it to keep your company alive, and you never knew. If she hadn't done that, Whitmore Holdings would have collapsed 2 years ago, cleanly, before the fraud got this deep, before it became criminal. He let that settle. In a strange way, her kindness 2 years ago is part of why the fall is so much worse now. She bought you time, and you used that time to dig the hole deeper. Richard put his face in his hands. He had spent his whole life believing that wealth was a fortress, that if you accumulated enough of it, you became untouchable, immune, safe. And now he understood, far too late, that wealth was not a fortress at all. It was a costume. And the moment the truth pulled the costume off, there was nothing underneath but a frightened old man who had thrown away the one person who had ever truly protected him, because she wore simple dresses and remembered the names of waiters. "I have to talk to her," Richard said suddenly, lifting his head. "Clara, I have to. Richard, I don't think—" "She saved me once, anonymously, which means she cared, Bernard, don't you see? Even after everything, even after how we treated her, she cared enough to save us 2 years ago. Maybe if I explain, if I apologize, if I—" "Richard!" Bernard's voice was firm now. "Listen to yourself. You're doing exactly what got you here. You're looking at a person and calculating what they can do for you. She saved you 2 years ago because she's a good person, not because you're owed anything. And the reason she won't save you now isn't cruelty. It's that she finally understands who you are. Don't call her. Don't beg. You've taken enough from that woman." But Richard was already reaching for his phone. He didn't call Clara directly. He knew that number would never connect for him now. Instead, he called his son. Daniel was in his small rented apartment, the one he had moved into after giving up the place he'd shared with Clara, when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. But it was his father, and something in Daniel, some stubborn remnant of loyalty, still could not let the old man face the darkness alone. "Dad." "Daniel!" Richard's voice was frantic. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to reach Clara. You saw her, didn't you? At the bookshop. I know you did. So you have a way to her. I need you to ask her, beg her if you have to make a statement, to vouch for the company, to tell the banks the assets have value. If Aureline Mason backs us, even a little, it could change everything. It could—" "No, Dad." The word came out flat and final. "Daniel, you don't understand. This is prison we're talking about. This is everything. This is our entire family, and she has the power to—" I said no. There was a stunned silence on the line. In 36 years, Daniel had never once refused his father. He had spent his whole life bending to Richard's will, absorbing his values, becoming his echo. And now, for the first time, he was standing on the other side of something. "I went to see her," Daniel said quietly. "You're right about that. And do you know what I did, Dad?" I apologized. For the first time in my life, I told the truth to someone and asked for nothing back. And she taught me something. She said a person's character isn't what they feel when everything falls apart. It's what they do when everything is fine, when no one's watching. His voice grew steadier. And I've been thinking about that every single day since. Because you and I, Dad, we had years when everything was fine, and we spent those years looking down on the one person who was quietly saving us. That's who we are, Dad. That's who we've always been. And I'm done being that person. Daniel. I'm not going to use the last conversation I'll ever have with Clara to beg her for money. Daniel said. "I'm not going to turn her kindness into a transaction. Not again. We've done that to her enough. If we go down, Dad, we go down honestly. For once in our lives, let's just take what we've earned." Richard was silent for a long time. "When did you become like this?" he finally said, and it was not a compliment. It was bewildered, almost accusatory. "This weakness, this surrender." And Daniel laughed softly, because he understood now that his father would never see it, that Richard would go to his grave believing that dignity was weakness and manipulation was strength, that the willingness to face consequences was surrender, that a life spent using people was a life well lived. "It's not weakness, Dad," Daniel said gently. "It's the first strong thing I've ever done. Goodbye. I love you. I'll come see you, but I won't call Clara." He hung up. And in doing so, Daniel Whitmore did something that surprised even himself. He became, for the first time, a man his ex-wife might have actually been able to respect. Too late to save the marriage, too late to change the past, but not too late to change himself. And in the ruins of everything he had lost, that small, quiet transformation was the one thing no bank could take from him. The end came for Whitmore Holdings on a Thursday, exactly 1 month after the party. The company filed for liquidation. Not restructuring, not protection, but full liquidation. Everything would be sold. The offices, the art, the cars, the house in the wealthy suburbs where Richard had hosted so many dinners, where he had introduced Clara so many times as Daniel's little wife. All of it would be auctioned to satisfy creditors who would still, in the end, recover only pennies on the dollar. And Richard Whitmore, who had spent 30 years building a monument to his own importance, watched it be dismantled piece by piece, and he understood that he would be remembered not as the man who built an empire, but as the man who built a fraud, and who lost everything, including the family that might have stood beside him if he had ever bothered to treat them like family. Vanessa Cross, meanwhile, discovered that the world she had schemed so hard to enter had no intention of catching her when she fell. She had walked out of that ballroom believing she was cutting her losses cleanly, abandoning a sinking ship before it dragged her down. But she had underestimated how small and how connected the world of wealth truly was. The story of what she had done, the affair, the manipulation, the way she had encouraged Daniel toward a public humiliation that had spectacularly backfired, spread through the social circles she had spent years trying to infiltrate. And those circles, which value nothing so much as loyalty and discretion, closed against her completely. The invitations stopped. The dinner parties she had angled to attend suddenly had no room for her. The wealthy men she had cultivated as potential next steps stopped taking her calls, because no man in that world wanted to be seen with the woman who had blown up a marriage and gotten caught doing it. Especially not when the wife she had wronged turned out to be one of the most powerful people any of them had ever heard of. Nobody wanted to make an enemy of Clara Voss by comforting Vanessa Cross. Vanessa had chased wealth her entire adult life, believing that if she could just get close enough to it, some of it would rub off on her. And in the end, she learned the cruelest lesson of all, which is that the world she wanted to belong to had been watching her the whole time, and it had decided she was not one of them, and it was right. She left the city within 2 months. Nobody knew exactly where she went. Nobody particularly cared. She had been a comet passing through other people's lives, bright and destructive and brief, and when she burned out, she left nothing behind but the damage. Clara heard about all of it, of course. Priya kept her informed, not because Clara asked, but because Priya believed she should know. And Clara received each piece of news with the same quiet, sober attention. The liquidation, the criminal charges filed against Richard, the disappearance of the dealer, Vanessa's exile. And through all of it, Clara did nothing. She did not make a statement. She did not gloat. She did not reach out to twist the knife, nor did she reach out to soften the blow. She simply let the consequences unfold, exactly as they would have unfolded if she had never married into that family at all. She had spent 3 years as the invisible hand holding them up, and now she was simply, finally, an absence. And in that absence, everything they had built on lies came down. But if anyone had expected Clara Voss to feel victorious, they would have been disappointed, Because on the night the Whitmore liquidation was finalized, Clara sat alone in her apartment, the modest one she had kept even after Daniel left, the one full of books left open face down and tea going cold on the counter. And she felt the strange, heavy grief that had been following her for weeks settle fully onto her shoulders. She thought about Richard, not the arrogant man who had dismissed her, but the frightened old man he had become, facing prison, facing ruin, facing the wreckage of a life that had been, underneath all the money, deeply and profoundly empty. And she found that she could not hate him. She had wanted to, once, but hatred required a kind of energy she no longer had, and more than that, it required believing that Richard's fall would make her feel better, and she knew now that it wouldn't. It hadn't. She thought about Daniel, about the man at the bookshop, apologizing, finally honest, finally seeing her, 3 years too late. She thought about the fact that he had refused in the end to beg her for help. Priya had told her about that too, that when Richard had tried to use Daniel as a channel to reach her, Daniel had said no, had refused to turn her kindness into a transaction, had chosen dignity over survival, and that, more than anything, had moved her. Because it meant that somewhere in the ruins, the man she had met at the gallery, the one who had asked about her books and actually listened to the answer, still existed. He had come back, too late to save what they'd had. But he had come back, and there was something almost unbearably sad about that. A person who becomes good only after they've lost everything is not the same as a person who was good all along. But they are also not nothing. They are a person who learned. And learning, however late, is not without value. Clara stood and walked to her window and looked out at the city lights, and she asked herself a question she had been avoiding for weeks. Had she done the right thing? She had built her whole life on her mother's words. Real value does not need to shout. Let your work speak before your name does. She had hidden her identity because she wanted to be loved for herself. And she had gotten her answer, hadn't she? Daniel had failed the test. Richard had failed the test. Their failure had exposed the fraud, and the fraud had destroyed them, and Clara had simply stepped out of the way. But standing at the window, watching the city, Clara felt the first real doubt she had allowed herself, because a small, quiet voice inside her asked, what if the test itself was the problem? What if, by hiding who she was, she had set a trap that any ordinary flawed human being might have fallen into? What if the very act of concealing herself, of watching and waiting and judging, had been its own kind of coldness? She had wanted to be loved for herself, but she had never given Daniel the chance to love the whole of her. She had shown him only half, and then she had judged him for failing to love a woman she had never fully revealed. It was a hard thought, an uncomfortable one, and Clara, who had spent her life refusing to look away from hard and uncomfortable truths, made herself sit with it. She did not conclude that she had been wrong to hide. Daniel's affair, his cruelty, his public humiliation of her, those were his choices, and no amount of self-reflection on Clara's part could excuse them. A man does not cheat on his wife and plot to shame her in front of 200 people because she kept a secret. He does it because of who he is. But Clara did conclude, sitting at that window, that the test had cost her something too, that she had spent 3 years watching instead of living, waiting instead of loving, holding back the whole of herself in the name of an experiment, and that even if the experiment had proven her right, it had also stolen 3 years she could never get back. 3 years of a marriage that might have had a chance, if she had been brave enough to be fully seen from the start. There was a lesson in that, she realized, not just for Daniel, for her too. Love should never require someone to become smaller. She had believed that about herself, that Daniel should have loved her without needing her to be a billionaire. But the reverse was also true. She had made herself smaller, hidden herself, shrunk her whole enormous life down into the fiction of a mid-level designer, and she had done it in the name of love. And that hadn't been love either. It had been fear. Fear of being wanted for the wrong reasons. Fear of the thing that had happened to her mother in that jewelry store, of being seen and dismissed. She had built her whole hidden life around not being that little girl again. And in protecting herself from that old wound, she had made it impossible for anyone to truly know her. Clara turned from the window. She walked to the wall where, in her office, the sketch of her mother's necklace hung, though of course that particular sketch was at headquarters. But she had a photograph of it here, in her apartment, a small framed print she looked at every night before bed. "I did what you taught me, Mom," she said softly to the photograph. "I let my work speak before my name. I stayed quiet. I didn't shout." She was quiet for a moment. "But I think maybe you meant something a little different than what I understood. I think you meant don't seek validation from people who can't see your worth. I don't think you meant hide your worth from the people you love." The photograph, of course, said nothing. But Clara felt standing there as if some knot inside her had finally loosened, as if she had learned at last the lesson her whole life had been trying to teach her. The point was never to hide. The point was never to test. The point was to be fully, bravely herself, and to offer that self freely to the world, and to let the people who could see her worth come close, and to let the people who couldn't fall away without needing to prove anything to them at all. She had spent 3 years running an experiment on her own marriage, and she had won the experiment, and she had lost 3 years, and now, finally, she was ready to stop experimenting and start living. The next morning, Clara did something she had not done in a very long time. She walked into Aureline Mason's headquarters, and she called a meeting of her senior leadership, and when they were all assembled, she told them something that surprised every person in the room. "I've spent 20 years running this company from behind a curtain," she said. "I built it that way on purpose. My mother taught me that real value doesn't need to shout, and I took that to mean that I should stay invisible, that the work should speak, and I should stay silent." She paused. "But I've come to understand that I misread her. There's a difference between not needing to shout and refusing to be seen. And for 20 years, I've been refusing to be seen, even here, even by the people who helped me run this." Priya, standing at the back, felt her throat tighten. "That ends today," Clara said. "Not because I want fame, not because I want recognition, but because I've learned that hiding yourself, even in the name of humility, even in the name of letting your work speak, comes at a cost. And I've paid that cost long enough." She looked around the room. "From now on, Aureline Mason is going to have a face. My face. Not because I need the world to know my name, but because I'm done being afraid of being known." The room was silent, and then one by one, her leadership team began to applaud. Not the polite applause of employees performing approval, but the real, warm applause of people who had worked for a woman they admired without ever fully knowing her, and who were, at last, being allowed to see her. Clara let the applause wash over her, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel exposed by being seen. She felt free, because the secret had never protected her. It had only isolated her. And now, standing in front of the people who had helped her build something beautiful, Clara Voss finally understood that her mother's greatest lesson had never been about hiding at all. It had been about knowing your worth so completely that you no longer needed anyone else to confirm it. And Clara, at long last, knew hers. Outside, the world went on. Whitmore Holdings dissolved into history. Richard prepared for a trial he could not win. Daniel began slowly and painfully the work of building an honest life from the ruins of a dishonest one. Vanessa vanished into obscurity, and the story of the quiet wife who turned out to own the empire her family worshipped passed into the kind of legend that people tell each other at dinner parties, a cautionary tale about the danger of judging a person by what they appear to own. But Clara was already past all of it. She had stopped carrying the Whitmores. She had stopped carrying the secret. She had stopped carrying the little girl in the jewelry store, waiting to be dismissed. She had put it all down, and her hands finally were empty enough to hold something new. 6 months passed the way seasons do, quietly, and then all at once, until one morning Clara Voss woke and realized that the storm which had once seemed like it would define the rest of her life had already begun to fade into something she only remembered when she chose to. She stood now in the private archive room at the heart of Aureline Mason's headquarters, the one place in the entire company she had always reserved for herself, and she held in her hands the original napkin, her mother's napkin. The first sketch, the one drawn 30 years ago in a 2-room apartment by a woman who had nothing but a broken dream and a sleeping daughter, and a fury born in a jewelry store where she had been treated like she did not belong. Clara traced the faded pencil lines with the tip of her finger. "Well, Mom," she said quietly, "I think I finally understand you." For most of her life, Clara had believed her mother's words were about restraint. Real value does not need to shout. Let your work speak before your name does. She had lived those words as a command to stay hidden, to stay quiet, to let the world discover her worth on its own, or not at all. And she had built a magnificent, lonely fortress out of that belief. But standing in the archive, holding the napkin, Clara understood at last what her mother had actually meant. Her mother had not been telling her to hide. Her mother had been telling her not to beg. There was a difference, and it had taken Clara 34 years and a shattered marriage to find it. Do not shout for validation from people who cannot see you, but do not disappear either. Stand in your worth, let it be visible, and let the right people come to it. Her mother had never wanted her to be invisible. Her mother had wanted her to be unshakable. There is a difference between a woman who hides because she is afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons, and a woman who stands fully in the open because she already knows her own value and no longer needs anyone to confirm it. For 20 years, Clara had been the first woman. Now, finally, she was becoming the second. "You spent your whole life being told you didn't belong," Clara said softly to the sketch. "In that store, in that world, and you decided to build something so beautiful that the people who dismissed you would spend their lives trying to be near it. And you did, we did. But I don't think the point was ever to make them chase us." She smiled, and there were tears in her eyes, but they were not sad ones. "I think the point was to become someone who never again needed their approval to know she mattered. That's the real inheritance, isn't it? Not the company, not the money, the knowing." She placed the napkin gently back into its protective case. Oraline Mason, in the months since Clara had stepped out from behind the curtain, had not suffered from having a public face. It had flourished. The story of its founder, the quiet woman who had built an empire while enduring a marriage that dismissed her, had captured something in people. Not the scandal, though there had been plenty of that. What captured people was Clara herself, her steadiness, her refusal to gloat, the way she spoke about her mother, about worth, about the difference between what a person owns and who a person is. She became, without ever trying to, a kind of quiet symbol for everyone who had ever been underestimated, for every person who had ever been looked at and dismissed, for every waiter whose name went unremembered, every ordinary soul the wealthy walked past without seeing. And she used that platform when it came to her exactly as her mother would have wanted, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but to build something. She launched a foundation. She named it after her mother, and its entire purpose was to find people the world had overlooked, artisans and craftspeople and designers laboring in obscurity, people with real value and no name to speak it, and to give them what her mother had never been given: a chance. A door held open instead of slammed shut, the exact opposite of a jewelry store that made a poor woman wait while it served the rich. The first time Clara stood in front of a room full of these people, young artisans who had traveled from all over to be part of the Foundation's inaugural program, she looked out at their faces, nervous and hopeful and disbelieving that someone like her would bother with someone like them, and she felt her mother standing beside her so vividly that she nearly turned to look. "I know what it feels like," Clara told them, "to have something real inside you and to have no one see it, to do good work and be treated as though you are invisible. I spent years being treated that way by people who thought they were better than me because of what they owned." She paused. "And I want to tell you the single most important thing I know. Your worth was never up for their approval. It was never theirs to grant or deny. It was always only yours. And the moment you understand that, truly understand it, no one can ever make you small again." The room was silent. And then a young woman in the front row, a jewelry designer barely 20 years old who had grown up with nothing, began to cry. And Clara stepped down from the podium and crossed the room and took the young woman's hand. And she remembered a 9-year-old girl in a jewelry store holding her mother's hand, watching a proud man make them wait. The wheel had come all the way around. The little girl who was made to feel she did not belong had grown into the woman who made sure others always would. As for the Whitmores, their story ended the way stories built on lies always end: quietly and without mercy. Richard Whitmore stood trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and in the end there was no dealer to blame, no shell company to hide behind, no daughter-in-law to quietly restructure the debt and make the problem disappear. There was only Richard, and his signature on the documents, and the truth he had spent years refusing to look at. He was convicted. And on the day of his sentencing, as he stood to hear the judgment, he looked older than his years, hollowed out, a man who had spent his entire life believing that wealth would protect him and had learned far too late that it was the flimsiest armor in the world. He served his time in a minimum security facility, and it was there, in the long, empty hours, that Richard finally did the one thing he had never done in freedom. He thought, really thought, about the woman he had called Daniel's little wife, about the empire he had worshipped without ever knowing its owner sat at his dinner table, about the salt she had passed him every Sunday while he looked down on her, about the fact that she had saved his company 2 years before it fell, anonymously, expecting nothing, and that he had repaid that invisible kindness by treating her as though she were nothing. He wrote her a letter. He never sent it. He did not have the right, and some small part of him, grown wiser in confinement, understood that. But he wrote it anyway, because he needed to say the words even if she never read them. In it, he wrote that he had spent 70 years measuring the wrong things, that he had built monuments to his own importance and called it a life, that the richest person he had ever known had been sitting quietly in his own home, and he had been too poor in spirit to see her. He wrote that he was sorry, and for the first time in his life, when Richard Whitmore said he was sorry, he was not calculating what the apology might get him. He was simply, finally, sorry. It changed nothing, but it changed him. And perhaps at the very end of a wasted life, that small change was the only thing of value Richard Whitmore ever truly earned. Daniel's path was different. He did not go to prison. He had known nothing about his father's financial fraud, and the investigators cleared him of any involvement. But he lost everything else. The name, the connections, the identity he had spent 36 years building around being a Whitmore. And in losing all of it, Daniel discovered something he had never once had while he possessed it. He discovered himself. He took a job, an ordinary one, at a firm where no one had heard of the Whitmores and no one cared, where he was judged not by his family name, but by whether he showed up and did the work. And to his own surprise, Daniel found that he was good at it, that there was a quiet satisfaction in earning something honestly, in being valued for what he did rather than for what he was born into. He moved into a modest apartment. He learned to cook. He learned the names of the people who worked in his building, the doorman, the woman at the coffee cart on the corner, and he learned that when you remember someone's name and ask about their life and actually listen to the answer, something happens between two people that all the money in the world cannot buy. He was learning, in other words, to be the kind of man Clara had always been. 3 years too late for their marriage, but not too late for his life. He never contacted her again. He understood that he had lost that right, and more than that, he understood that reaching out would be, in its own way, one final act of taking. Clara had given him everything a person could give, her patience, her protection, her love, and the last gift he could offer her was to finally stop asking her for anything at all. So he let her go, completely. And there was a strange grace in that letting go, the grace of a man who had finally learned that love sometimes means absence, that the most respectful thing you can do for someone you have wronged is to simply, quietly, leave them in peace. But he thought of her often. On quiet mornings making his own tea now, he would remember the way she used to hum in the kitchen, and he would feel the loss of her not as a wound anymore, but as a lesson permanently learned. She had been the best thing in his life. He had not known how to value her, and now he spent every ordinary day trying to become a man who would have, not to win her back. That door was closed, and he had closed it himself, but to honor what she had tried to teach him, to make sure that the next person he loved, whoever she might one day be, would be loved the way Clara had always deserved to be, fully, from the start, without conditions, without tests, without needing to prove her worth to earn his care. That was Clara's real legacy in Daniel's life, not the scandal, not the loss, but the man he was slowly, painfully becoming because of what she had shown him. And Clara herself? Clara lived. That was the simplest and most profound thing about how her story resolved. She did not become a bitter woman nursing a grievance. She did not become a hardened executive who had learned to trust no one. She did the opposite. Having finally put down the secret she had carried for 20 years, having finally stopped hiding, she found herself lighter than she had ever been. And she filled that new lightness with a life that was fully, bravely her own. She traveled, not for business but for herself, to the small workshops and studios around the world where the artisans her foundation supported were creating beautiful things. And she sat with them, and she learned from them, and she remembered why she had fallen in love with the work in the first place. She reconnected with old friends she had kept at a distance for years because keeping her secret had made intimacy difficult. She let people know her, all of her, the billionaire and the woman who read 3 books at once and left them open face down all over her apartment. For the first time in her adult life, there was no gap between who Clara Voss appeared to be and who she actually was. And in that wholeness, she found a kind of peace that no amount of secrecy had ever given her. One evening, nearly a year after the night at the Grand Leora Hotel, Clara sat in her apartment with Priya, who had over the years become less an assistant and more the closest friend Clara had. They were drinking tea, the good kind, and the city glittered outside the window, and Priya asked the question she had been wanting to ask for a long time. "Do you ever regret it?" Priya said. "Hiding who you were, all those years. If you'd just told Daniel from the start, maybe things would have been different. Maybe you'd still be married. Maybe none of it would have happened." Clara considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "For a long time, I thought I regretted it," she said finally. "I thought if I'd only been honest, if I'd only let him see the whole of me, maybe he would have risen to it. Maybe the man I met at the gallery would have stayed." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "But I've come to see it differently. Daniel didn't fail a test I set. Daniel simply showed me who he was. And here's the thing, Priya. If I'd told him everything from the start, I would never have known. I would have spent my whole life with a man who treated me well because I was powerful, and I would never have known whether he'd have treated me the same way if I were nobody. The secret didn't cause his failure. It only revealed it." She looked up. "And I would rather know the truth, even a painful truth, than live a comfortable life built on not knowing." "But you were alone all those years," Priya said gently. "Even with him, even in the marriage, you were carrying all of it by yourself." "Yes," Clara said, "and that was my mistake. Not the secret itself, but what I let it do to me. I let it isolate me. I confused being unknowable with being safe." She smiled softly. "That's the part I've changed. Not that I keep fewer secrets, but that I've stopped hiding. There's a difference. A secret you keep to protect yourself from being used, that's wisdom. A wall you build so no one can ever truly reach you, that's fear. For 20 years I couldn't tell them apart. Now I can." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said. "Not because of the company, because of who you've become." And Clara felt her eyes sting because she believed it was true. "She used to tell me," Clara said, "that real value doesn't need to shout. And I spent my whole life thinking that meant I should be silent. But I finally understand what she really meant." She set down her tea. "She meant that when you truly know your worth, you don't need to prove it to anyone. Not by shouting, but also not by hiding. You just live it, openly, honestly. And you let the people who can see it come close, and you let the people who can't fall away, and you never, ever let someone else's blindness convince you that you're the one who's invisible." The city lights glittered on, indifferent and beautiful, and the two women sat together in the comfortable silence of a friendship built on being fully known. And this is where Clara Voss's story truly ends. Not with revenge, though she could have had it, not with the satisfaction of watching her enemies fall, though they fell, but with something far rarer and far more valuable. It ends with a woman who was underestimated by everyone, who was dismissed and betrayed and humiliated in front of the world, and who chose, in response to all of it, not to become cruel, but to become free. Daniel Whitmore lost everything because he valued status over the soul of the person beside him. Richard Whitmore lost his empire because he valued appearance over honesty and never once saw the treasure he sat across from every Sunday. Vanessa Cross lost her future because she confused proximity to wealth with worth itself. Each of them chased something they could hold in their hands, and each of them ended with empty hands because the things they chased were never the things that mattered. But Clara Voss gained the only thing that ever truly matters. She gained the unshakable knowledge of her own worth, held so completely that no man's blindness, no family's contempt, no counterfeit necklace or public humiliation could ever again make her doubt it. The quiet wife everyone underestimated was never powerless. She was never the small, invisible woman they believed her to be. She was, the entire time, the one holding the whole empire in her hands. And more than that, she was the one holding the one thing none of them ever possessed, a character so solid that it did not bend, did not break, and did not need anyone's permission to stand. And the greatest mistake Daniel Whitmore ever made was not divorcing a billionaire. Any fool can lose money. His true mistake, the one he will carry for the rest of his life, was failing to recognize the value of the woman he already had, back when she seemed to have nothing to offer him but herself. Because in the end, that is the only measure of a person that has ever mattered. Not what they own, not the name they carry or the fortune they command, but how they treat the people around them when they believe those people have nothing to give, when they think no one important is watching, when there is no reward for kindness and no punishment for cruelty. That is the truth Clara Voss knew from the beginning, the truth her mother sketched onto a napkin in a 2-room apartment 30 years ago, the truth that outlasted an empire built on lies. Real value never needs to prove itself. It simply endures. And Clara Voss endured, whole and free, and finally, fully seen. 2 years after the night that ended the Whitmore Empire, on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, Clara Voss received a letter that would open a door she thought had closed forever. It arrived not at her office, where a wall of assistants filtered everything, but at the foundation, hand-delivered by a young woman who worked in the mailroom and who did not recognize the name on the envelope. It was addressed simply to Miss Clara Voss, in careful handwriting, and inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed a small workshop, a jeweler's bench worn smooth with use, tools hung neatly on a pegboard. And at the bench, hunched over some delicate work, sat a young woman Clara did not recognize, perhaps 19 or 20, her face lit with the particular concentration of someone who has found the one thing they were born to do. The letter read, "Miss Voss, you do not know me, but you changed my life without ever meeting me. 2 years ago, my grandmother told me a story about a woman who owned a great luxury company and who was humiliated by a family that did not know who she was. She told me this story not because of the scandal, but because of what you said afterward, that a person's worth is never up for someone else's approval. I was 17. I was ready to quit. Everyone told me that a girl like me, from a place like mine, had no business dreaming of becoming a jeweler. Your words were the reason I did not quit. I am now an apprentice. The photograph is me, at my bench, doing the work I love. I wanted you to know that a sentence you spoke, which you have probably forgotten, became the foundation of a life. Thank you. You never met me, but you saved me." Clara read the letter 3 times, and then she sat very still for a long moment, holding the photograph, looking at the young woman at her bench. And she thought about her mother. She thought about a 2-room apartment and a napkin and a jewelry store where a proud man had made a poor woman wait. She thought about the fury and the promise that had come out of that humiliation, the promise to build something so beautiful that the people who dismissed her would spend their lives trying to be near it. And she thought about how she had misunderstood that promise for most of her life, believing it was about proving something to the people who looked down on her. But it had never been about them at all. It had been about this, about a girl at a bench, 2 years and 1,000 miles away, saved by a sentence. The The point had never been to make the powerful chase you. The point had been to reach down and pull up the next girl who was told she did not belong. The whole enormous edifice of Orline Mason, all the wealth and the beauty and the legend, existed for no greater purpose than this single photograph in Clara's hands. She picked up the phone and called Priya. "I want to meet her," Clara said. "The girl who wrote the letter. Find her. And Priya, I want to do something bigger. I've been thinking about it for a while, and this letter just decided it." "Bigger how?" Priya asked. "I want to build a school," Clara said. "Not a program, not a foundation grant, a real school for the artisans the world overlooks. A place where a girl who's been told she doesn't belong can walk in the door and be told, for the first time in her life, that she does. I want to build the place I wish had existed for my mother." There was a silence on the line. "Clara," Priya said softly, "that would cost a fortune, even for you." "I know," Clara said, and she was smiling. "It's the best possible use of a fortune I can think of." The girl's name was Sophia. She was 19, and she came from a small town far from any city. And when Priya finally tracked her down and arranged for her to meet Clara, she arrived so nervous she could barely speak, convinced there had been some mistake, that a person like Clara Voss could not possibly want to meet a person like her. Clara met her not in a boardroom, but in the archive, in the private room where the original napkin was kept. "I read your letter," Clara said, when the introductions were done, and the girl was still trembling. "I've read it many times now, and I want you to know something before we talk about anything else." She looked at the young woman steadily. "You did not misunderstand what I said 2 years ago. You understood it better than most people twice your age. Your worth is not up for anyone's approval, not mine. Not your town's, not anyone's. It never was." Sophia's eyes filled. "Come here," Clara said gently. "I want to show you something." And she led the girl to the case where the napkin lay, and she told her the whole story. The 2-room apartment, the mother who had nothing, the jewelry store, and the man who made them wait, and the promise made in fury and pain. She told Sophia about the sleeping baby and the pencil sketch, and the empire that had grown from it, and she told her that everything, all of it, had led to this exact moment. A girl from a small town standing in front of the sketch that had started it all. "My mother drew this," Clara said, "because someone told her she didn't belong, and she decided to prove them wrong. But do you know what I've learned, Sophia? Proving them wrong was never the real victory. The real victory was becoming a woman who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, including them." She turned to the girl. "That's what I want for you. Not to spend your life proving the people in your town wrong, but to become someone so certain of your own worth that their opinion simply stops mattering. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded, though she was crying too hard to speak. "I'm building a school," Clara said, "for people like you, and I would like you to be one of its first students, not out of charity, because I saw your work in that photograph, and it's good, Sophia. It's really good. You have something, and I want to help you make it into everything it can be." And in that moment, in the archive room at the heart of an empire, a 19-year-old girl who had been told her whole life that she did not belong was told, by the most powerful woman she had ever met, that she did. The wheel had turned again, and it would keep turning, Clara understood now, long after she was gone. Because that was the true inheritance, not the money, not the company. The turning of the wheel, one dismissed girl lifting up the next, forever. The school took 2 years to build. Clara named it after her mother, of course, the same name as the foundation, so that everywhere the work reached, her mother's name went with it. And on the day it opened, Clara stood before a crowd of students, teachers, artisans, and journalists, and she gave a speech that would be remembered long after the details of the old scandal had faded from memory. "People sometimes ask me about the night my marriage ended," Clara began. "The night at the hotel, the counterfeit necklace, the husband who did not know who I was. It became a kind of famous story, and I understand why. It has villains and a twist and a woman who was underestimated and turned out to be powerful all along." She paused. "But I want to tell you what that story is actually about, because it isn't about revenge, and it isn't about wealth, and it certainly isn't about a necklace." The crowd was silent. "That night, a man handed me a fake, and told me it might finally make me look like I belonged, Clara said. And here is what I want every young person in this room to understand. The necklace was fake, but so was everything he valued. The status, the name, the whole glittering world he thought made him superior. All of it was counterfeit. And the only real thing in that room, the only authentic thing, was the one thing he had spent 3 years failing to see. A person's character, mine, and tragically, his own. She let that settle. He thought he was the one holding something valuable, and I was the one who had nothing. He had it exactly backwards. He was holding a fake. I was holding myself. And in the end, that was worth more than everything his family owned. She looked out at the students, at Sophia in the front row, at all the young faces that reminded her so much of the girl she had once been. Real value never needs to prove itself, Clara said. I know that phrase has become associated with me now. People put it on things. But I want you to hear what it truly means, from the person who lived it. It does not mean stay silent. It does not mean hide. My mother taught me that phrase, and for most of my life I got it wrong. I thought it meant I should disappear, that I should let my work speak while I stayed invisible. And I built a fortress out of that misunderstanding, and I spent 20 years lonely inside it. A ripple moved through the crowd. Few of them had ever heard her admit such a thing. It took losing my marriage to learn what she really meant, Clara continued. Real value doesn't need to prove itself, does not mean hide your worth. It means know your worth so completely that you no longer need anyone else's permission to feel it. It means you can stand fully in the open, fully seen, fully yourself, and let the people who recognize your value come close, and let the ones who can't fall away without ever once believing that their blindness is your flaw. She smiled. The woman I was 2 years ago hid because she was afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons. The woman standing here today doesn't hide from anything, because I finally understand that no one can make me invisible unless I agree to disappear, and I never will again. The applause, when it came, was thunderous, but Clara barely heard it, because she was looking at Sophia, and Sophia was looking back at her, and in the girl's face, Clara saw the whole future of the thing she had built. Not the company, the other thing, the knowing, the certainty that passes from one underestimated soul to the next, unbreakable, unstoppable, eternal. That evening, after the crowds had gone, Clara did something she had not done in a long time. She thought about Daniel, not with bitterness. That had left her years ago. She thought about him the way you think about a person you once loved, from a great distance, with a strange and gentle sorrow. Priya had told her, some months back, that Daniel was doing well, that he had built an honest, quiet life, that he had married again, a woman who worked as a teacher, nobody important by the standards of the world Daniel had once worshipped, and that by every account he treated her with a tenderness and attention that the old Daniel had never been capable of. And Clara had felt, hearing that, not jealousy, but something closer to relief, because it meant the lesson had taken. It meant that the man at the gallery, the one who asked about her books and actually listened, had finally come back to stay, in a life that was no longer hers, but was, at least, a real life, an honest one, built on the hard-won understanding of everything he had once thrown away. She hoped he was happy. She meant it. A woman who has truly put down her burdens can afford to wish her old wounds well, and Clara had put hers down long ago. She never saw him again. And that was right. Some chapters are meant to close completely so that the pages that come after can be written clean. Years later, when Clara Voss was an old woman, she would sit in that same archive room, older now, her hair silver, her hands marked by time, and she would look at her mother's napkin behind its glass, and she would think about the whole arc of it. The 2-room apartment, the jewelry store, the marriage that revealed a man's true nature, the night at the hotel, the empire that fell, and the school full of students who had been told they did not belong and who now belonged more fully than the people who had once dismissed them ever would. And she would understand, with the deep and settled peace of a life fully lived, that her mother had been right all along. Real value does not need to shout. It does not need to prove itself. It does not need anyone's approval to be real. It simply endures. It passes from hand to hand, from one overlooked soul to the next, quietly, steadily, outlasting every empire built on lies and every man who ever mistook a fortune for a life. The quiet woman everyone underestimated had understood this from the beginning, and in the end, long after the Whitmores had faded into a cautionary tale, long after the counterfeit necklace had been forgotten, one truth remained, as solid and as luminous as the day her mother first sketched it onto a napkin in a two-room apartment. A person's worth is never measured by what they own. It is measured by how they treat others when they believe no one is watching. Clara Voss had lived that truth when she had nothing to gain from it, had held to it when the world gave her every reason to become cruel, and had passed it on to 1,000 young souls who would carry it long after she was gone. She was never the small, invisible woman they believed her to be. She was the woman holding the whole empire in her hands and holding, more importantly, a heart that money could not buy and cruelty could not break. And that, in the end, was the most valuable thing she ever owned.